Learners, we continue with our source-based questions on the Great Depression. We're now on to source 1C. This source explains how people invested in stocks and shares to become rich. The common stocks of their country have in the past 10 years increased enormously. During my discussion with you, you will remember I told you that stocks and shares are investments people make in companies. When companies make huge profits, those who buy the stocks and shares in those companies get what are known as dividends, and you can become very rich. So you could buy a stock or a share at 10 Rand today, and in 2 years' time, that stock could be worth 100 Rand. Now, they will give you examples as we go along. The common stocks of their country have in the past 10 years increased enormously in value because the business of the country has increased. $10 invested 10 years ago in the common stock of General Motors would now be worth more than $1.5 million. That is an incredible, staggering figure, telling you that over a 10-year period, $10 had multiplied to be worth so much more because there was such a demand for automobiles or vehicles, in particular the Model T Ford. And the manufacturer, General Motors, is only one of many first-class industrial corporations. If a man saves $15 a week and invests in good common stocks and allows the dividends and rights to accumulate, in other words, to grow, at the end of 20 years, he will have at least $80,000 and an income from investments of around $400 a month. He will be rich. And because income can do that, I am firm in my belief that anyone not only can be rich, but ought to be rich. This is taken from a book called Everybody Ought to Be Rich. The author is J. Raskob. We will now move on to the questions related to this. The first question asks us, why, according to the source, did the price of shares increase in the 1920s? Now, if you look at this here, they tell you, if you look at the second sentence, it increased because the business of the country increased. So your first answer there should be, the price increased because the business of the country had increased. Please be careful. I don't like the way this sentence has been started. Remember, I told you, you do not start the sentence with because. So you should actually state, according to the source, the price of shares increased because the business of the country increased. Your second question, name one industrial corporation that attracted good returns on their shares. Good returns means made profits on their shares. Simple, taken from the source. You'll find it here. There's an answer. General Motors is an example of one of those. You could give other examples. There's a company like Hoover, which was producing vacuum cleaners. So even that is acceptable. The third one, use the source and your own knowledge to explain how people made money from investing in stocks and shares. Here they're saying your own knowledge and the sources. So you need two answers here. So as an ordinary person, you could buy shares in the market and you could make money. If the company did well, that means your dividends, your profit would increase. Secondly, ordinary people waited for the share price to increase and then they sold their shares. So what you would have paid for today as 100 Rand could be worth 500 Rand in 6 months' time, and you might decide to sell it then. That means you made a profit of 400 Rand, just as an example. Thirdly, people bought stocks and shares on credit. This was called buying on the margin and enables speculators to sell off shares at a profit before paying what they owed. Now, this was basically almost like gambling. What they did was they borrow money from the banks, and before the money was due to be paid back to the bank, they made a significant interest in a very short space of time. It could even be within a few days. And they paid off whatever their shares, they bought off whatever shares and paid it off to their banks, the money that they owned, and in that way, they made a huge profit. But this soon proved to be a weakness in the economy. I'm moving on to source 1D. This is a visual source. The others were written sources. This is an illustration of the consequences of the collapse of the stock exchange, or what was known as the Wall Street crash. It says the source depicts the consequences of the collapse of the stock exchange. It's taken from a website, spartacuseducational.com. It was accessed on the 5th of April 2018. Please be careful. It doesn't mean it was drawn on the 5th of April 2018. The person who drew up these questions used the source from the internet in April 2018. Now, if you look at the source, there are a group of men lined up one behind the other. Look at their demeanor. Demeanor means their posture, the way they are standing. Look at the way they are dressed. And very importantly, look at the caption below the source, which says, "Excuse me, buddy, is this the bread line or a run on the bank?" And the person that's saying that is the last person in that queue. He's talking to the person in front of him and saying, "Excuse me, buddy." So there's no such word as excuse. It's just a shortened form of "excuse me, buddy," or excuse. And buddy here is just the person. It's a polite way of referring to the person in front of him. More like a friend. Is this the bread line or a run on the bank? Now, when you recall the section on the Great Depression, the consequences, you will remember there were some devastating impacts that the Great Depression had. And I did mention to you, some people who had been millionaires were poverty-stricken overnight. They became bankrupt. So here in this illustration, part of the consequences are evident. You look carefully, you'll see the people here don't look confident. They actually look quite desperate, despondent. You can say they look depressed. They are huddled. Their entire body posture is they are leaning forward. The situation to them seems hopeless. The person at the back of the queue is a bit uncertain whether this queue is actually the bread line. Now, the bread line means that they were standing there waiting for food. Or is it a run on the bank? The run on the bank means, are they there to collect money from the bank that is owed to them? You will find that many of the people try to get their money out in desperation. Unfortunately, the banks had no money. The first question related to source 1D, what can you learn about the impact of the Great Depression on the American population? So as you had noted in the source, people were huddled, they looked despondent and desperate. So one of the answers you could give there is, it caused massive unemployment. Excuse me. Learners, my apologies. I seem to have forgotten to discuss this question with you related to source 1C. explain why over-speculation led to the crash of the Wall Street Stock Exchange. So just to go back to source 1C, if we look at this here, why over-speculation led to the collapse of the Wall Street Stock Exchange. We said speculation was where people had bought shares by borrowing money from the banks. So for this particular question, you could have one of these answers. In September 1929, the share prices began to slowly decline. Shareholders panicked and started to sell their shares, and prices fell dramatically as sellers tried to sell their shares. All this is related to the fact that people began to grow afraid that the value of their shares was dropping drastically. When they saw others selling their shares, they went into panic mode and they also began to sell their shares. And that resulted in the collapse of the Wall Street Stock Exchange. Coming back to question 1.4, remember the numbering here should be 1.4.1 going downwards, all related to source 1, A, B, C, D. So coming to source 1D now, what can you learn about the impact of the Great Depression on the American population? And as I said, from the picture source, you would have gathered that there was a great deal of despondency. So here for 2 marks each, you need two answers. The results were that it caused massive unemployment. People lost everything they owned. It also caused starvation. Many people stood in lines waiting for bread or soup. Many people withdrew their money at the time, hence the reference to bank run. Bank run means people in desperation went to the bank to withdraw whatever they had because they knew in time the banks would not have any money. 2.4.2, compare 1B and 1D. How does the information in 1B contradict the evidence in 1D with regard to the American way of life? So let's go back to those sources. There's 1D. Here you can see it's all doom and gloom. And if you go back to 1B, it tells us that the majority is conceived to be living on a scale reserved for the privileged classes elsewhere. What they're asking us, with the word contradicted means, how are they opposite of each other? How do they directly, like 180-degree difference, show 180-degree difference in the two sources? This source is telling us that Americans were very wealthy, prosperous, successful. They were living a very comfortable life. In comparison, if we look at source 1D, you can see these are not the same type of people living in desperation. These are the American people, but they're not living under the same conditions they had been living in during the early 1920s. So in reference to that question, how does 1B contradict 1D? You will say here, source 2B states that the majority of Americans lived a life conceived on a scale reserved for the privileged classes elsewhere. Whilst, look at this word whilst. Whilst means you are discussing two sources comparing on the same point, and this is the linking word. 2B shows that people were poor and did not have anything to eat. So one is talking about Americans living a privileged life. Source 2B, on the other hand, American people now who have nothing to eat. So the way of life in the first part is very extravagant. The way of life here is one of desperation. Then the other comparison is source 2B states that most Americans had access to radios, telephones, and cars. Source 2D shows people owned nothing. They had no possessions. They were extremely poor. So both of these answers here, these are 2 questions for 2 marks each. Remember, you must compare on the same issue. This one's talking about way of life or the standard of living. This is also talking about the standard of living, but they are talking about possessions or what they owned in particular. This brings us to an end with regard to source 1b. We're now going to be looking at the question relating to the paragraph. The last question in the source-based section on the Great Depression is the paragraph question. Every source-based question, remember, ends with a paragraph that you're required to write. In this case, it's only for 6 marks. They tell you about 60 words, but don't be restricted by this. However, if you write 100 words, etc., you're wasting your time. If you write too little, that's also inadequate. So make sure 60 words is about 6 lines. If you go to 8 lines, it's fine. Do not be hampered by the number of words. Make sure you have the essence or the most important aspects of the question covered. So let's look at the question. It says, using the information from the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 6 lines explaining the causes of the Great Depression. Importantly, using the relevant sources and your own knowledge. And you're focusing on the causes. So why did the Great Depression take place? Now, there's adequate information in all 4 sources for you to find the causes of the Great Depression. Now, if you look at the first source, for example, the first source here will tell you about the high growth rate in the American economy because of the increase in production. So that in itself does not tell you about the causes. What might tell you about the causes is looking at the Fordney-McCumber Act, where the Americans raised their customs duties and they tried to limit goods coming into the country. But when they did that, it backfired on them because other countries said, if you want to sell your goods to us at a high price and you don't want us to export to you because you charge us heavy taxes, we will do the same. If you try to export to us, we will also increase the tariffs. So let's look at some of the reasons. Now remember, we spoke about the Peel method. Use that method here to answer. The Fordney-McCumber Act protected the American economy by placing high tariffs on imports. I already mentioned that to you. So it's one of the causes of the Great Depression. In the long run, Americans found that they were not able to sell all the extra goods they had produced because other countries were charging them high tariffs in response to them charging other countries high tariffs. European countries reacted by imposing high tariffs on American goods or US imports. US companies found they could not sell their products. These are all interrelated. The Americans, when they say they, the American companies started to lay off workers, which led to unemployment. Lay off workers means to retrench them. The US had the highest standard of living according to Source B, and they had encouraged people to become rich. Factories were producing in mass. In mass means in large quantities. This caused overproduction. What that means is that there were too many goods and not enough people to buy it. So when demand dropped, they were saddled with the surplus products that they could not sell. Factories made smaller profits and they started to lay off workers. Other reasons were that people bought shares on the stock market and they bought on the margin. In other words, they borrowed money from banks, they bought on credit. When the price of shares fell, that means they could not get their money back when the Great Depression or when the Wall Street crash took place. Buying stocks and shares was a means of becoming rich. It led many people to overspeculate. Overspeculate means they began to basically gamble on the stock market. They began to guess, when can I make money quickly? Panic sales followed, which led to the Great Depression. Many people withdrew their money from the banks. It was called a bank run. Millions of people became unemployed and they stood in bread lines for assistance. Now, not all of this is necessary. Remember, we said about 6 to 8 lines. So if you have the relevant facts, you will get your 6 marks accordingly. That then brings an end to the source-based question on the Great Depression.